X-Men lore, the complete story of Marvel's mightiest mutants. In the sprawling universe of comic book mythology, few franchises have captured the imagination quite like the X-Men. Born in the tumultuous early 1960s, these heroes emerged not just as colorful characters fighting villains, but as symbols of something deeper, something that would resonate across generations and speak to the very heart of what it means to be different in a world that demands conformity. Tonight, we journey through the intricate history of the X-Men, exploring their origins, their greatest triumphs, their darkest hours, and the enduring legacy that has made them one of the most beloved superhero teams in all of fiction. The birth of a legend, origins and creation. The year was 1963. America stood at a crossroads, with the civil rights movement gaining momentum, the Cold War casting its shadow across the globe, and a new generation beginning to question the established order. It was into this world that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby introduced a team of heroes unlike any that had come before. The X-Men debuted in September of 1963, emerging from the creative minds of two men who had already revolutionized the comic book industry with their previous work on the Fantastic Four. Stan Lee, the legendary writer and editor who had co-created Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, and countless other Marvel heroes, was looking for a new approach to superhero storytelling. Publisher Martin Goodman had seen the success of the Fantastic Four and wanted more team books to capitalize on that popularity. But Lee had grown weary of concocting elaborate origin stories for each new character, stories involving radioactive spider bites, cosmic rays, or laboratory accidents. He wanted something simpler, something more elegant. What if, he wondered, the heroes were simply born with their powers? What if their abilities were a natural part of who they were, emerging during puberty like any other aspect of human development? This concept led to the creation of mutants, individuals born with an extraordinary gene that granted them superhuman abilities. Lee initially wanted to call the series The Mutants, but Goodman rejected the title, believing that readers wouldn't understand what a mutant was. So Lee pivoted, naming them the X-Men after their mentor, Professor X. The official explanation given in that first issue was that these students possessed an extra power that ordinary humans did not, hence the name X-Men, for extra power. But readers quickly came to understand that the X stood for Xavier himself, the wheelchair-bound telepath who gathered these young mutants to teach them how to use their abilities for the greater good. Jack Kirby, the artistic genius who had co-created Captain America decades earlier, brought the X-Men to visual life with his distinctive, dynamic style. Kirby's work on the X-Men was characterized by the same bold, kinetic energy that had made the Fantastic Four such a sensation. His designs for the original team's uniforms, simple matching outfits in blue and yellow, would become iconic, though they would evolve significantly in the years to come. Kirby also contributed crucial concepts to the series, including the Danger Room, the high-tech training facility where the X-Men honed their skills. This innovation gave writers the ability to open stories with exciting action sequences, establishing the tone before diving into the plot. The first issue of X-Men hit newsstands in September of 1963, cover dated with a publication date in July. That historic first issue introduced readers to 5 young mutants and their teacher. The original team consisted of Cyclops, whose eyes emitted powerful beams of concussive force that he could only control with specially designed ruby quartz visors. There was Marvel Girl, whose telepathic and telekinetic powers made her one of the most formidable members of the team. Beast, whose ape-like appearance and incredible agility made him both tragic and heroic. Angel, who possessed magnificent feathered wings that allowed him to soar through the skies. And Iceman, the youngest of the group, who could generate and manipulate ice with remarkable precision. These 5 students were gathered at Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, a mansion in Westchester County, New York, that served as both an educational institution and the X-Men's headquarters. To the outside world, It appeared to be an exclusive private school for exceptional young people. In reality, it was a sanctuary where mutants could learn to control their powers away from the fear and prejudice of a world that didn't understand them. Professor Charles Xavier, the school's founder and the X-Men's mentor, was himself a powerful mutant, possessing telepathic abilities that made him one of the most powerful minds on the planet. Confined to a wheelchair due to a past injury, Xavier dedicated his life to his dream of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants. The first issue also introduced the X-Men's greatest nemesis, Magneto, the master of magnetism. Magneto commanded the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, a group that included Mastermind, Quicksilver, Scarlet Witch, and Toad. Where Xavier believed in cooperation and understanding between humans and mutants, Magneto saw only conflict and domination. This philosophical divide, this fundamental disagreement about the path forward for mutant kind, would become the beating heart of X-Men mythology, explored and re-explored across decades of storytelling. The early X-Men comics, while introducing groundbreaking concepts, didn't initially achieve the commercial success that Marvel had hoped for. Lee's run on the series lasted only 19 issues, and Kirby departed even earlier, leaving with issue number 17 in 1966. The creative team changes that followed brought in talents like Roy Thomas and Neil Adams, who produced some memorable stories in the late 60s, but it wasn't enough to save the title from declining sales. By March of 1970, X-Men stopped producing new stories with issue number 66. The title continued to be published, but from December of 1970 through April of 1975, Marvel simply reprinted older issues, renumbering them as issues 67 through 93. For 5 years, the X-Men existed in a kind of limbo, their adventures frozen in time while the Marvel Universe continued to evolve around them. Many assumed the team had run its course, that the concept simply hadn't resonated with readers. But as we'll see, the X-Men were merely dormant, waiting for the right creative vision to unleash their true potential. The seeds planted by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby in 1963 would eventually blossom into one of the most successful and influential franchises in all of comic book history. The mutant concept, powers, prejudice, and Professor X's dream. At the core of the X-Men mythology lies a concept that was revolutionary when it was introduced and remains powerfully relevant today. The idea that superhuman abilities can be inborn, a natural part of human evolution rather than the result of accidents or experiments. In the Marvel Universe, mutants are born with a genetic trait called the X gene, which typically manifests during puberty, granting them extraordinary powers. This mutation, according to Xavier's teachings, represents the next step in human evolution. Mutants are not deviations from humanity, but rather Homo superior, the species that will eventually succeed Homo sapiens. This concept allowed for incredible diversity in the types of powers displayed by mutants. Unlike the Fantastic Four, whose powers all stemmed from the same cosmic ray accident, or the Avengers, who had various distinct origins, every mutant had their own unique expression of the X gene. Some, like Cyclops, had offensive capabilities. Others, like Professor X, possessed mental powers. Still others had physical mutations that altered their appearance or granted them enhanced physical abilities. This variety made the X-Men universe endlessly expandable, allowing new characters to be introduced with fresh and interesting powers. But the true genius of the mutant concept lay not in the powers themselves, but in what they represented metaphorically. From the very beginning, though not always explicitly, the X-Men stories touched on themes of prejudice, discrimination, and the fear of the other. Mutants, born different through no fault or choice of their own, found themselves feared and hated by the very humanity they sought to protect. This dynamic created a unique tension that set X-Men apart from other superhero stories. Where Spider-Man might be misunderstood or the Hulk feared, the X-Men represented an entire class of people, systematically oppressed simply for being who they were. As the decades passed, this metaphor became increasingly explicit and powerful. Professor Charles Xavier came to be compared to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights leader who advocated for peaceful integration and understanding between races. Xavier's dream was one of harmony, where mutants and humans would live side by side, each respecting the other's right to exist. He believed that education, demonstration of goodwill, and patient advocacy would eventually win over human hearts and minds. His X-Men were trained not just to use their powers, but to be heroes in the truest sense, protecting a world that hated and feared them in the hope that their actions would prove mutants worthy of acceptance. Magneto, in contrast, became associated with Malcolm X and his more militant approach to civil rights. Having witnessed the Holocaust firsthand as a Jewish child in Nazi concentration camps, Magneto's worldview was shaped by the darkest chapter of human history. He had seen what happened when one group decided another was inferior, when prejudice was allowed to metastasize into genocide. Magneto believed that humans would never willingly accept mutants, that conflict was inevitable, and that mutants needed to seize power before humans could exterminate them. His philosophy was summarized in his famous declaration, borrowed from Malcolm X himself: by any means necessary. The tension between these two philosophies, between Xavier's hope and Magneto's cynicism, between integration and separation, between peace and power, would drive countless X-Men stories over the years. It wasn't a simple good versus evil dynamic. Both men had valid points rooted in their experiences. Xavier's privilege as a wealthy, physically able white man, despite his wheelchair, allowed him to believe in the goodness of humanity in a way that Magneto, a Holocaust survivor, could not. Yet Magneto's methods often led to exactly the kind of violence and persecution he claimed to oppose. This moral complexity elevated X-Men storytelling beyond simple superhero fare into something more nuanced and thought-provoking. The X-Men mythology also introduced powerful storytelling devices that explored these themes. The Sentinels, giant robots designed to hunt and capture mutants, served as a chilling representation of systematic oppression. Created by humans who feared mutant power, these machines became recurring antagonists, representing the ultimate expression of anti-mutant prejudice. Anti-mutant hate groups like the Friends of Humanity, Humanity's Last Stand, and the Purifiers echoed real-world hate organizations, giving form to the abstract concept of bigotry. Perhaps most powerful were the stories set in Genosha, a fictional island nation where mutants were enslaved by an apartheid state, forced to use their powers for the benefit of the human ruling class. These storylines, published in the 1980s, were direct commentaries on the contemporary situation in South Africa, where the apartheid system was still in place. The X-Men's fight to liberate Genosha's mutants wasn't just a superhero adventure. It was a statement about the real-world struggle for human rights and dignity. The School for Gifted Youngsters itself represented Xavier's vision in action. It was a place where young mutants, often rejected by their families and communities, could find acceptance and belonging. They could learn to control powers that might otherwise be dangerous or frightening. They could discover that being different didn't mean being alone. The school became a powerful symbol of sanctuary, education, and hope. For readers who themselves felt like outsiders, whether because of their race, religion, sexuality, or simply their interest in comic books, the X-Men offered a fantasy of finding a place where being different was celebrated rather than condemned. This metaphorical richness, this ability to speak to real social issues through the lens of superhero fantasy, would become the X-Men's greatest strength. As the years passed and society grappled with new forms of prejudice and discrimination, the X-Men remained relevant. LGBTQ+ readers found resonance in stories about mutants hiding their true nature from intolerant families. Immigrants connected with tales of mutants seeking refuge from persecution. Anyone who had ever felt like an outsider could see themselves in these colorful heroes. The X gene became a stand-in for any characteristic that might make someone a target of hatred or fear, and Professor Xavier's dream became everyone's dream, a world where difference was not just tolerated but embraced. The original five: Cyclops, Marvel Girl, Beast, Angel, and Iceman. When readers first opened X-Men #1 in September of 1963, they were introduced to five remarkable young people who would become the foundation of one of comics' greatest franchises. Each of the original five X-Men brought unique abilities, personalities, and struggles to the team, and though they would eventually be overshadowed by later additions, their importance to X-Men mythology cannot be overstated. These were the first students of Professor Xavier's dream, the proof of concept for everything that would follow. Scott Summers, known as Cyclops, was the first X-Man, the leader of the team despite his youth. Orphaned as a child when a plane carrying his family crashed, Scott was separated from his younger brother Alex in the chaos that followed. His mutant power manifested during adolescence. As a teenager, Scott discovered that he could emit powerful beams of concussive force from his eyes. These weren't heat beams or lasers, despite how they were often drawn, but rather focused blasts of pure kinetic energy. The problem was that Scott couldn't control them. Once his eyes opened, the beams would continuously fire unless blocked by a ruby quartz crystal, the only substance that could contain his power. This inability to control his abilities made Scott's power both a gift and a curse. He was forced to wear a special visor made of ruby quartz at all times, and even then, he could never simply look at the world without potential danger. He couldn't make eye contact with loved ones, couldn't see a sunrise without his protective eyewear, couldn't let his guard down for even a moment. This burden shaped Scott's personality, making him disciplined, controlled, and perhaps a bit rigid. He was the perfect soldier, following Professor X's orders without question and expecting the same from his teammates. His leadership style was tactical and by the book, which sometimes put him at odds with more impulsive team members. Jean Grey, the sole female member of the original team, went by the codename Marvel Girl in those early days. She was the last to join Xavier's school, arriving after the other four had already begun their training. Jean was a powerful telepath and telekinetic, though her abilities were initially portrayed as less developed than they would later become. Xavier took a special interest in Jean, helping her erect mental barriers to protect her from the overwhelming influx of thoughts from those around her. This close relationship between mentor and student would become complicated in later stories, but in the beginning, Xavier was simply a teacher helping a frightened young woman learn to control abilities that could easily overwhelm her. Jean quickly became the heart of the team, her compassion and empathy balancing Scott's tactical mindset. She was also the object of romantic interest from multiple team members, particularly Scott and Warren, creating one of comics' earliest love triangles. Jean's character in these early stories was somewhat limited by the sexism of the era, often relegated to support roles and damsel-in-distress situations. But beneath the dated portrayal lay the foundation of what would become one of the X-Men's most complex and powerful characters, especially when she would later bond with the Phoenix Force and transform into one of the most iconic figures in Marvel history. Hank McCoy, the Beast, was the team's intellectual powerhouse. Despite his ape-like appearance, with enlarged hands and feet and a somewhat simian face, Hank was actually the most academically gifted member of the team. He had a genius-level intellect and a love of literature and science that made him equally at home in the laboratory or the library. His mutant abilities granted him superhuman strength, agility, and reflexes, making him an acrobatic fighter who could bounce around the battlefield with incredible dexterity. Hank's character was defined by the contrast between his monstrous appearance and his gentle, cultured personality. He spoke in an educated, almost Victorian manner, frequently quoting literature and using advanced vocabulary. This dichotomy made Hank McCoy one of the most tragic of the original X-Men. He looked like a monster but had the soul of a poet. Society judged him by his appearance, never taking the time to discover the brilliant, kind person beneath the exterior. Later in his history, Hank's appearance would become even more beast-like, initially through a self-inflicted experiment gone wrong, and eventually evolving into the blue-furred, cat-like form that most readers recognize today. But in those early issues, Hank McCoy represented the pain of being judged by one's appearance, of being treated as less than human despite possessing all the qualities that make someone truly human. Warren Worthington III, codenamed Angel, came from a background of wealth and privilege. The heir to a vast fortune, Warren could have lived a life of ease and comfort if not for the large, feathered wings that sprouted from his back. These wings, initially hidden beneath specially designed clothing, eventually became impossible to conceal. Warren's mutation was visible and undeniable, making him a target for both fear and fascination. His ability to fly was one of the more straightforward powers on the team, but it was also one of the most visually striking. There was something almost heavenly about Angel in those early appearances, a beautiful young man with white wings soaring through the sky. Warren's character brought a different perspective to the team. Coming from money, he had connections and resources that the others lacked. He was confident, sometimes bordering on arrogant, and his romantic interest in Jean Grey put him in direct competition with Scott for her affections. Warren represented the mutant who could have been accepted by society if he'd just hidden his differences, but who chose instead to embrace what made him unique. His journey would eventually take him to dark places, particularly when he would later lose his wings and be transformed into one of Apocalypse's horsemen. But in these early stories, he was simply a rich young man trying to do good with the gifts he'd been given. Bobby Drake, Iceman, was the youngest of the original five, essentially the kid brother of the team. His power to generate and manipulate ice was formidable, though he initially struggled to fully control it. Bobby could create ice slides to travel on, form protective shields, and freeze opponents solid. Despite the serious nature of his abilities, Bobby's personality was light-hearted and joking, using humor to deflect from his own insecurities about his age and power level. He was the team's comic relief, but also the character with the most growing to do. Bobby's journey through X-Men history would be marked by a gradual realization of his true potential. For years, he was portrayed as the weakest of the original five, unable to fully tap into his abilities. It would later be revealed that this was partly psychological, that Bobby held himself back out of fear of his own power. When he finally learned to fully embrace his abilities, he became one of the most powerful mutants in existence. An Omega-level threat capable of manipulating moisture in the air, freezing entire cities, and even reconstituting himself after being shattered. But in those early issues, he was just a teenager trying to find his place on a team of more experienced heroes. Together, these five young mutants formed the first class of X-Men. They trained in the Danger Room, fought villains like Magneto and the Sentinels, and struggled with the dual challenge of mastering their powers and fitting into a world that feared them. Their dynamics set the template for all future X-Men teams: the stern leader, the compassionate heart, the intellectual, the cocky showboat, and the young rookie. The relationships they formed, particularly the romantic tension between Scott and Jean, would echo through decades of X-Men stories. The original five represented Professor Xavier's dream in its purest form. They were teenagers learning to control their abilities, trying to prove that mutants could be heroes, could be trusted, could be integrated into society. They weren't soldiers or revolutionaries. They were students, young people who wanted to make the world better. That innocence, that optimism, would be tested and often shattered in the years to come, but it remained at the core of what the X-Men represented. These five young heroes, despite their relatively brief time in the spotlight before the title went into reprints, laid the foundation for everything that would follow. They proved that mutant heroes could work, that readers would care about these characters and their struggles. The Xavier-Magneto divide, two paths for mutant kind. If the X-Men represent the heart and soul of mutant heroism, then the relationship between Charles Xavier and Eric Laneshare, better known as Magneto, represents the philosophical core of the entire franchise. These two powerful mutants, once friends and allies, embody competing visions for the future of mutant kind. Their conflict transcends simple heroics and villainy, delving into fundamental questions about power, prejudice, and the proper response to oppression. Understanding the Xavier-Magneto dynamic is essential to understanding what makes X-Men storytelling so compelling and enduring. Charles Francis Xavier was born into privilege and wealth. The heir to the Xavier fortune, young Charles grew up in a mansion in Westchester County, New York, surrounded by comfort and opportunity. Despite his advantaged upbringing, Charles faced his own challenges. His mutation, which granted him immense telepathic abilities, manifested early, forcing him to cope with the thoughts and emotions of everyone around him. Later in life, an accident would confine him to a wheelchair, adding another layer of complexity to his identity. Yet even with these hardships, Xavier's worldview remained fundamentally optimistic. He believed in the better angels of human nature, convinced that education, patience, and demonstrated goodwill could overcome fear and prejudice. Xavier's dream was elegant in its simplicity and ambitious in its scope. He envisioned a world where humans and mutants coexisted peacefully, each recognizing the value and dignity of the other. He believed that if mutants proved themselves to be heroes, if they protected humanity from threats regardless of how humanity treated them, they would eventually earn acceptance and respect. To that end, he founded his school for gifted youngsters, gathering young mutants and training them not just in the use of their powers but in heroism, ethics, and self-sacrifice. His X-Men were to be living proof that mutants were not a threat but an asset to humanity. There was something deeply paternalistic about Xavier's approach, though he would likely never acknowledge it. He sought to make mutants acceptable to human society by teaching them to control their powers, to be non-threatening, to prove their worth. In many ways, this mirrors real-world respectability politics, the idea that marginalized groups can achieve acceptance by conforming to mainstream expectations. Xavier's dream placed the burden of change on mutants themselves rather than on the prejudiced society that feared them. It asked the oppressed to be patient with their oppressors, to turn the other cheek in the hope that eventually hearts would change. Eric Laneshare's path to mutant activism took a far darker route. Born in Germany in the 1930s to a Jewish family, young Eric experienced the rise of Nazi power firsthand. His family was torn apart, sent to concentration camps where Eric witnessed unspeakable horrors. He survived the camps, emerging into a world that had shown him humanity's capacity for cruelty and genocide. The trauma of these experiences shaped everything about Eric's worldview. He had seen what happened when one group of people decided another was inferior, when prejudice was allowed to flourish unchecked. The Holocaust taught Eric that waiting for acceptance, hopping for tolerance, was a death sentence. Eric's mutant power manifested in the camps, an ability to manipulate magnetic fields that would make him one of the most powerful beings on Earth. This power, combined with his experiences, forged him into Magneto, the master of magnetism. Where Xavier saw potential for coexistence, Magneto saw only an inevitable conflict. Where Xavier preached patience, Magneto demanded immediate action. He looked at human-mutant relations and saw the same patterns that had led to the Holocaust: fear, dehumanization, calls for registration and control, the slow build toward extermination. He refused to wait for humans to decide whether mutants deserved to live. Instead, he advocated for mutant supremacy, for taking power rather than asking for acceptance. Magneto's philosophy was rooted in survival. He believed that the strong must dominate to avoid being dominated, that mutants must seize control of their destiny before humans could enact their genocidal plans. His Brotherhood of Mutants wasn't just a villain team. It was a revolutionary movement, a declaration that mutants would no longer accept second-class status or live in fear. Magneto's methods were often brutal, and his goals sometimes veered into genuinely villainous territory, but the core of his ideology came from a place of legitimate trauma and fear. He was a Holocaust survivor who refused to let history repeat itself, even if it meant becoming the aggressor. The genius of the Xavier-Magneto dynamic lay in its moral complexity. Neither man was entirely right or entirely wrong. Xavier's peaceful approach had a certain moral superiority, but it required mutants to suffer patiently while waiting for human hearts to change, assuming such change would ever come. It placed the burden of de-escalation on the victims of prejudice rather than its perpetrators. Xavier could afford to be patient because he had wealth, power, and the telepathic ability to defend himself. Not all mutants were so fortunate. Magneto's militant approach, while understandable given his history, often created the very conflicts he claimed to prevent. His aggressive actions gave ammunition to those who feared mutants, reinforcing the narrative that mutants were dangerous and needed to be controlled. His willingness to sacrifice human lives in pursuit of mutant safety made him genuinely dangerous, not just a misunderstood activist but sometimes an actual villain. Yet his cynicism about human nature was repeatedly validated by the Marvel Universe's depiction of anti-mutant prejudice, government-sponsored sentinel programs, and attempted genocides. The relationship between these two men was further complicated by their personal history. In various tellings of their origin, Xavier and Magneto met as young men, before either had fully committed to their respective paths. They were friends, perhaps even close friends, who recognized in each other a fellow mutant of immense power and intelligence. They debated philosophy, discussed the future of mutant kind, and ultimately found that their visions were incompatible. Their falling out was depicted as genuinely tragic, a friendship destroyed by irreconcilable ideological differences. Even as enemies, they retained a grudging respect for one another, each recognizing the validity of some of the other's arguments even while opposing their methods. This dynamic between integration and separatism, between peaceful protest and militant resistance, between hope and cynicism, gave X-Men stories a depth that pure superhero slugfests could never achieve. Battles between the X-Men and the Brotherhood weren't just about stopping a villain's scheme. They were about fundamental disagreements over the nature of humanity, the proper response to oppression, and the best path forward for an entire species. Readers could sympathize with both sides even while rooting for one or the other. The Xavier-Magneto divide held up a mirror to real-world conflicts, asking readers to grapple with difficult questions about justice, power, and resistance. The Giant-Size Revolution: How New Blood Saved the X-Men. In the spring of 1975, after 5 years of publishing nothing but reprints, the X-Men were on the verge of fading into obscurity. The original series had been effectively dead since 1970, and while Marvel had kept the numbering going with reprinted stories, there seemed little reason to believe the franchise had any future. But behind the scenes, something extraordinary was brewing. A writer named Len Wein and an artist named Dave Cockrum were about to resurrect the X-Men in spectacular fashion, introducing a new team that would not only save the franchise, but transform it into one of the most successful properties in all of comics. The revival of the X-Men began as an editorial initiative by Roy Thomas, who was serving as Marvel's editor-in-chief at the time. Thomas had always been fond of the X-Men and had written for the title himself in the late 60s. He wanted to do something ambitious with the relaunch, creating a more international team that would appeal to readers beyond the United States. The original X-Men had been entirely American, 5 white teenagers from the US for the new team. Thomas envisioned gathering mutants from around the world, representing different cultures and nationalities. This wasn't just progressive thinking, it was also smart marketing, as Marvel was looking to expand its international presence. Artist Dave Cockrum was brought on board to design the new team members. Cockrum had previously worked on Legion of Superheroes for DC Comics, where he developed a talent for creating visually striking characters with distinctive costumes and powers. He threw himself into the project with enthusiasm, designing multiple new characters and working out their powers, costumes, and personalities. The original plan had writer Mike Friedrich attached to script the series, but behind-the-scenes changes complicated matters. Roy Thomas stepped down as editor-in-chief, and Len Wein took his place. In the shuffle, Wein ended up taking over writing duties on the X-Men revival as well. The result of these creative efforts hit stands in May of 1975, though it was dated April with the publication actually occurring in February. Giant Size X-Men #1 was a special oversized issue, 68 pages of story and art that would change the course of Marvel history. The cover, penciled by Gil Kane and inked by Dave Cockrum, showed the new team bursting into action, with the tagline Deadly Genesis, promising dramatic changes. Inside, readers found a story titled Second Genesis, a title that perfectly captured what Wein and Cockrum were attempting, a complete reboot of the X-Men concept with new blood and new energy. The plot of Giant Size X-Men #1 was straightforward but effective. The original X-Men, minus Cyclops, had disappeared on a mission to the mysterious island of Krakoa in the South Pacific. Only Scott Summers escaped to bring word of the disaster. Professor Xavier, unable to mount a rescue with just one X-Man, realized he needed to assemble a new team. Using his Cerebro device to locate mutants around the world, Xavier recruited a diverse group of heroes for this desperate rescue mission. The setup allowed Wein and Cockrum to introduce each new character individually, giving readers a taste of their powers and personalities before bringing them together. The new recruits were unlike anything readers had seen in an X-Men comic before. From Canada came Wolverine, a short, fierce fighter with retractable claws and a healing factor that made him nearly impossible to kill. Wolverine had been introduced just months earlier in The Incredible Hulk #181, created by Len Wein and John Romita Sr., and was quickly establishing himself as a fan favorite. Adding him to the X-Men roster was a stroke of genius that would eventually make Wolverine one of Marvel's most iconic characters. From Kenya came Ororo Munro, known as Storm, a woman who could control the weather with a thought. Storm was a truly regal character, worshipped as a goddess in her native Africa before Xavier recruited her. Her powers were among the most formidable in the Marvel Universe, capable of summoning hurricanes, calling down lightning, and manipulating atmospheric conditions on a massive scale. Dave Cockrum's design for Storm was striking. A beautiful black woman with white hair and a flowing cape, every inch a goddess made flesh. Storm would become not just a powerful X-Man, but one of the most important black female superheroes in comics. From the Soviet Union came Pyotr Rasputin, Colossus, a gentle farmer who could transform his body into organic steel, granting him enormous strength and near invulnerability. Colossus represented a fascinating character type. The gentle giant, a young man of tremendous physical power who was at heart an artist and a pacifist. His transformation into steel was visually dramatic, and the contrast between his metal form and his sensitive personality made him immediately compelling. From Germany came Kurt Wagner Nightcrawler, perhaps the most visually distinctive of the new recruits. Nightcrawler looked like a demon, with blue fur, yellow eyes, pointed ears, a tail, and only 3 fingers on each hand. His appearance had made him a target of prejudice his entire life, hunted by villagers who thought him a monster. Yet beneath his demonic exterior, Kurt was the kindest, most faithful member of the team, a devout Catholic who saw his powers as a gift from God. His ability to teleport in a puff of sulfurous smoke made him invaluable in combat, and his swashbuckling personality, influenced by Errol Flynn movies, made him a joy to read. From Japan came Sunfire, Shiro Yashida, a hot-headed hero who could generate and manipulate intense flames. Sunfire had been introduced in earlier X-Men comics as a sometimes ally, sometimes adversary, and his prickly personality and fierce Japanese pride made him stand out from the more team-oriented recruits. From Ireland came Sean Cassidy, Banshee, a former Interpol agent whose sonic scream could shatter steel or allow him to fly. Banshee was older than the other recruits and brought experience and maturity to the team. Rounding out the new roster was John Proudstar, Thunderbird, an Apache warrior with enhanced strength and speed, who represented Native American cultures in the team's international lineup. These 7 new X-Men, along with Cyclops as the only holdover from the original team, embarked on their rescue mission to Krakoa. The island itself turned out to be a mutant, a living landmass that fed on the life energy of other mutants. The battle against Krakoa was epic in scope, requiring the combined powers of both the new team and the rescued original members. In the end, it was Polaris, one of the captured X-Men, who used her magnetic powers to launch Krakoa into space, an ending suggested by a young writer named Chris Claremont who would soon take over the series. The resolution of the story presented Xavier with a dilemma. He now had 2 full teams of X-Men. The original 5 minus Cyclops decided to leave the team, pursuing their own lives and goals. This left Cyclops leading the new international team: Storm, Wolverine, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Banshee, Sunfire, and Thunderbird. Well, mostly. Sunfire, in character, quit the team immediately, while Thunderbird would tragically die in just the 2nd issue of the relaunched series, making his tenure as an X-Man heartbreakingly brief. Giant Size X-Men #1 was a commercial success, selling well enough that Marvel decided to revive the main X-Men title with new stories. Issue number 94 of Uncanny X-Men, published in August of 1975, continued the story with Len Wein plotting and a young Chris Claremont scripting. By issue 96, Claremont had taken over completely, beginning a run that would last 16 years and transform the X-Men into the most popular superhero team in comics. Dave Cockrum's artwork gave the stories a dynamic, visually exciting quality that made every page a pleasure to read. The international makeup of the new team was genuinely groundbreaking for its time. While some of the characterizations could be stereotypical by modern standards, the effort to represent different cultures and nationalities was progressive for 1975. More importantly, it made narrative sense. If mutants were being born all over the world, why should Xavier's school only recruit Americans? The diversity of the new team brought different perspectives and experiences to the stories, enriching the X-Men mythos. The Giant-Size X-Men revival didn't just save the franchise, it revolutionized it. The new team brought fresh energy, new dynamics, and new story possibilities. Wolverine's rough edges contrasted with Cyclops' by-the-book leadership, creating tension. Storm's regal bearing and vast power made her a natural leader in her own right. Nightcrawler's faith and humor lightened the team's darker moments. Colossus's innocence and artistic nature provided a counterpoint to the violence of their missions. These weren't just colored costumes with powers. They were fully realized characters with distinct personalities, backgrounds, and motivations. The success of this relaunch proved that superhero teams could evolve, that new blood could revitalize even a seemingly dead franchise. It established templates that would be used again and again in X-Men comics. The team of diverse international heroes, the mix of experienced members and rookies, the balance of different power types and personalities. Most importantly, it set the stage for Chris Claremont's legendary run, which would take these characters and this concept to heights no one could have imagined in 1975. The Dark Phoenix Saga, Rise and Fall of a Cosmic Power. If Giant-Size X-Men #1 represented the rebirth of the franchise, then the Dark Phoenix Saga represented its ascension to greatness. This storyline, running through Uncanny X-Men issues 129 through 138 from January to October of 1980, is widely considered not just the greatest X-Men story ever told, but one of the finest superhero narratives in the history of comics. Written by Chris Claremont and illustrated by John Byrne, the Dark Phoenix saga took Jean Grey, the original Marvel girl, and transformed her into one of the most powerful and tragic figures in the Marvel Universe. The seeds of the Dark Phoenix saga were actually planted years earlier, in what fans now call the Phoenix Saga, running through issues 101 to 108 from 1976 to 1977. In that story, the X-Men found themselves in space on a mission to save the universe. Their shuttle was caught in a solar radiation storm while returning to Earth, and Jean Grey, in an act of ultimate heroism, piloted the ship herself while telepathically shielding her teammates from the radiation. She knew this was a suicide mission, that the radiation would kill her, but she made the sacrifice anyway to save her friends. As the shuttle plunged toward Earth, something miraculous happened. A cosmic entity known as the Phoenix Force, drawn to Jean's heroic self-sacrifice and powerful mutant abilities, bonded with her. The Phoenix Force was pure energy, the embodiment of life and passion in the universe, capable of incredible feats of creation and destruction. It saved Jean's life, or so everyone believed, replacing her body with a duplicate while the real Jean went into a healing coma at the bottom of Jamaica Bay. But for years, no one knew this. The Phoenix Force believed it was Jean Grey, possessing all her memories and emotions, and everyone, including Jean's teammates and lover Scott Summers, accepted the Phoenix as Jean. The Phoenix Force granted Jean godlike powers. She could manipulate matter and energy on a cosmic scale, traverse the universe in an instant, and wield telepathic and telekinetic abilities that dwarfed her previous mutant powers. For a time, she used these abilities heroically, helping the X-Men save the universe from threats like the Mad Shi'ar Emperor D'Ken and his attempt to destroy reality using the M'Kraan crystal. The Phoenix was a hero, and Jean seemed to have adapted to her newfound power remarkably well. But such power came with dangers. The Phoenix Force, while not inherently evil, was a primal cosmic force, operating on a scale that transcended human morality, and the human consciousness inhabiting it, believing itself to be Jean Grey, was being slowly corrupted by the intoxicating nature of godhood. The Dark Phoenix saga proper began with the machinations of the Hellfire Club, a secret society of wealthy, powerful mutants who operated in the shadows of human civilization. They were led by Sebastian Shaw and included among their number Emma Frost, the White Queen, a powerful telepath who would become an important figure in X-Men lore. The Hellfire Club wanted to control the Phoenix, to harness its power for their own ends. One of their members, Jason Wingard, better known as the villain Mastermind, used his illusion powers to mentally seduce Jean. He created elaborate fantasies in her mind, convincing her that she was his lover, the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club in an 18th century setting. These psychic seductions, shown in flashback sequences drawn with stunning period detail by John Byrne, gradually broke down Jean's mental defenses and moral compass. The X-Men's confrontation with the Hellfire Club, depicted in issues 132 through 134, was intense and brutal. The team was captured, with Wolverine left for dead in the sewers beneath the Hellfire Club's Manhattan headquarters. The issue where Wolverine single-handedly fought his way back up through the building to save his teammates became legendary, cementing his status as a fan favorite. But even as the X-Men battled the Hellfire Club, a greater drama was unfolding in Jean's mind. Mastermind's manipulations, combined with the intoxicating nature of the Phoenix power, caused Jean to fully embrace her darker impulses. She broke free of Mastermind's control, but not in a good way. Instead, she transformed into Dark Phoenix, a being of pure destructive power driven by passion and hunger rather than morality or compassion. Dark Phoenix radiated power that dwarfed anything the X-Men had encountered before. She easily defeated both the X-Men and the Hellfire Club, then flew into space, seeking to satisfy the Phoenix Force's cosmic hunger. What followed was one of the most shocking moments in comic book history. In Uncanny X-Men issue 137, Dark Phoenix, needing to refuel her cosmic power, consumed an entire star. The star's destruction caused a chain reaction that destroyed all the planets in its system, including one inhabited by billions of sentient beings. In an instant, Jean Grey, the compassionate hero who had been a founding member of the X-Men, had committed genocide on an unimaginable scale. She had destroyed an entire civilization to feed her hunger for power. This act drew the attention of the Shi'ar Empire, an advanced alien civilization that maintained order across vast sections of the galaxy. The Shi'ar recognized the Phoenix Force as an extinction-level threat, and they couldn't allow such a being to exist unchecked. Led by Empress Lilandra, who happened to be Professor Xavier's lover, the Shi'ar traveled to Earth to execute judgment on Jean Grey. They demanded her death as the only way to ensure the Phoenix Force wouldn't destroy the universe. Professor Xavier pleaded for Jean's life, arguing that she could be cured, that the Phoenix Force could be separated from her or controlled. The Shi'ar agreed to a compromise, trial by combat. If the X-Men could defeat the Shi'ar's Imperial Guard, the universe's most powerful team of super beings, Jean would be spared and receive treatment. If they lost, Jean would die. The battle took place on the blue area of the Moon, one of the few places in the solar system with breathable atmosphere, in issue 137. The X-Men fought valiantly, with each member pushing themselves beyond their limits to save their friend. But the Imperial Guard was simply too powerful. One by one, the X-Men fell. Cyclops, Wolverine, Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, all were defeated despite their best efforts. The battle was lost. As the Imperial Guard closed in for the kill, Jean made a choice. In a moment of clarity, the real Jean Grey, buried somewhere beneath the Phoenix Force, reasserted control. She realized that she was too dangerous to live, that even if she was spared now, the Phoenix Force might rise again, might destroy more worlds, more civilizations. In the abandoned Kree city on the Moon, Jean activated an ancient weapon, a powerful energy cannon. She looked at Scott one last time, told him she loved him, and let the weapon fire. The blast killed her instantly, destroying her body and dispersing the Phoenix Force. Jean Grey died a hero, sacrificing herself to save the universe from the power she wielded. The final page showed the X-Men in mourning, gathered around Jean's coffin with the caption reading, "Jean Grey could have lived to become a god." But it was more important to her that she die, a human. The Dark Phoenix Saga's impact on comics cannot be overstated. It proved that superhero stories could handle genuinely tragic narratives, that characters readers loved could fall from grace and face consequences for their actions. Jean's death wasn't reversed immediately, as was typical in comics. She stayed dead for years, her sacrifice lending weight to the story. The saga explored themes of power and corruption, asking what happens when someone gains abilities that transcend morality, when the rules that govern ordinary people no longer seem relevant. The story also solidified Chris Claremont and John Byron's reputation as one of comics' greatest creative teams. Byron's artwork throughout the saga was stunning, from the intimate character moments to the cosmic scope of the Phoenix's power. His designs for the Hellfire Club, his detailed space opera visuals for the Shi'ar Empire, and his emotional rendering of Jean's final sacrifice all demonstrated why he was considered one of the industry's top artists. Claremont's scripting gave every character distinct voices and motivations, building a narrative that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The Dark Phoenix saga has been adapted multiple times in various X-Men media, including animated series and films, though none have quite captured the power of the original comic story. The themes it explored, the tragedy of its ending, and the sheer scope of its narrative made it a watershed moment in superhero comics. It showed that the X-Men could tell stories as ambitious and emotionally resonant as anything in literature, that colorful heroes and cosmic threats could be vehicles for profound human drama. Days of Future Past, a dystopian warning. Just 2 years after the Dark Phoenix saga reshaped X-Men mythology, Chris Claremont and artist John Byrne delivered another landmark storyline that would have lasting impact on the franchise and superhero comics as a whole. Days of Future Past, published in Uncanny X-Men issues 141 and 142 in 1981, told a story of time travel, dystopian futures, and the horrifying consequences of allowing prejudice and fear to guide government policy. Despite being only 2 issues long, this story created one of the most influential alternate futures in comics and introduced concepts that would be referenced, revisited, and re-explored for decades to come. The story began in the year 2013, though at the time of publication that was still decades in the future. This timeline showed a nightmare America, a nation that had allowed anti-mutant sentiment to spiral completely out of control. The Sentinels, those giant mutant-hunting robots that had appeared sporadically in X-Men comics since the 60s, had taken over the United States. What began as a government program to protect humanity from mutant threats had evolved into a machine dictatorship, where the Sentinels themselves called the shots, having determined that humans needed protection from themselves as well as from mutants. In this dark future, mutants and superhumans had been hunted to near extinction. Those who survived were imprisoned in internment camps, forced to wear inhibitor collars that suppressed their powers. The camps were surrounded by Sentinel patrols, and escape was nearly impossible. The cityscape shown in the opening pages was a devastated wasteland, with the ruins of once great cities serving as grim monuments to humanity's failure. The mood was oppressive and hopeless, a far cry from the relatively optimistic tone of most superhero comics. The story introduced readers to a group of surviving mutants in this timeline, now middle-aged and hardened by decades of suffering. Among them were older versions of familiar characters: Wolverine, now called simply Logan, grizzled and scarred but still fighting; Colossus and his wife, Shadowcat, now called Kate, whose phasing power had proven useful for evading Sentinel detection; Storm, Magneto, and others, all bearing the weight of a world that had destroyed everything they'd fought to protect. Most shocking was the revelation of who had died in this timeline. On a wall in a cemetery, a memorial listed fallen heroes and villains alike: Cyclops, killed in the initial Sentinel attacks; Jean Grey, Banshee, Beast, Dazzler, Nightcrawler, and countless others, their names a roll call of loss. The plot of Days of Future Past hinged on a desperate plan. The survivors believed that this dark timeline had been created by a single pivotal event in the past: the assassination of Senator Robert Kelly by the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Kelly's murder had sparked a wave of anti-mutant hysteria, leading to the passage of the Mutant Registration Act and eventually the Sentinel takeover. If they could change that one event, if they could prevent Kelly's assassination, perhaps this future could be averted. Kate Pryde, the older version of Kitty, possessed a unique ability that made time travel possible. Using her phasing power in conjunction with the telepathic abilities of an older Rachel Summers, daughter of Scott and Jean from another timeline, Kate could project her consciousness backward through time into her younger self. The plan was risky and desperate, but it was their only hope. Kate's consciousness would travel back to 1981, inhabiting the body of 13-year-old Kitty Pryde, and she would have to convince the X-Men of that era to prevent Kelly's assassination. The story then shifted between two timelines. In 1981, Kitty Pryde suddenly began acting strangely, speaking with the knowledge and desperation of someone decades older. She had to convince the X-Men that she was telling the truth, that she was their teammate from a dark future, come back to prevent a catastrophe. Her claims were wild and seemingly impossible, but the X-Men, particularly Professor Xavier, sensed the truth in her words. They agreed to help, mobilizing to stop the Brotherhood's attack on Senator Kelly. Meanwhile, in the future timeline, the remaining X-Men launched a suicide mission. They would assault the Sentinel stronghold in New York City, trying to destroy the Central Sentinel Command and buy time for the time travel plan to work. This mission was portrayed with brutal honesty. There was no expectation of survival, no hope of victory in any meaningful sense. They were simply trying to disrupt the Sentinels long enough for the past to be changed. The battle was fierce and hopeless, with the future X-Men falling one by one against the overwhelming power of the Sentinels. In the past, the X-Men confronted the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants at a Senate hearing where Kelly was scheduled to testify about mutant affairs. The Brotherhood, including Mystique, Destiny, Pyro, Avalanche, and Blob, launched their attack, attempting to assassinate Kelly and prove that mutants were dangerous. The X-Men intervened, and a brutal battle ensued in the halls of Congress. The fight was desperate, with both teams pushing their powers to the limit. The younger Kitty Pryde, still inhabited by her older self's consciousness, used her phasing ability to protect Senator Kelly, literally pulling him through walls and away from the Brotherhood's attacks. The climax came when Destiny, a precognitive mutant who could see possible futures, recognized what Kitty was trying to do. Destiny understood that Kelly's survival might prevent the dark future from coming to pass, but she also knew that even if Kelly lived, other timelines might be just as bad or worse. The future was always in flux, always uncertain. In the end, the X-Men succeeded in their immediate goal. Senator Kelly survived the assassination attempt. The Brotherhood was defeated and captured. But the question remained, had they actually changed the future? The story's ending was deliberately ambiguous. Back in the future timeline, the battle with the Sentinels reached its conclusion. The X-Men were overwhelmed, with Wolverine, Colossus, and Storm all falling in combat. Kate Pryde's consciousness snapped back to her older body just as a Sentinel's energy blast struck her down. The last panel showed the Sentinel standing over her body. The question of whether the past had been changed left unanswered. This ambiguity was intentional and powerful. Days of Future Past wasn't offering easy answers or guaranteed happy endings. It was warning that the path humanity was on, the increasing prejudice against mutants, the calls for registration and control, could lead to catastrophe. Even though the X-Men had saved Kelly in 1981, the story suggested that this dark future might still come to pass if vigilance was abandoned, if fear was allowed to drive policy, if society continued down the road of scapegoating and persecution. The Days of Future Past timeline became one of the most referenced alternate futures in X-Men lore. It was revisited in numerous stories, with various characters traveling to or from that timeline, exploring different aspects of that dark world, or showing how other characters survived or fell in that future. The visual of the memorial wall with its list of dead heroes became iconic, recreated in animated series, referenced in other comics, and even adapted for the X-Men film franchise. The story's themes remained painfully relevant across the decades. The Mutant Registration Act it depicted echoed real-world debates about civil liberties and government surveillance. The Sentinel takeover reflected fears about artificial intelligence and autonomous weapon systems. The internment camps recalled historical atrocities from the Holocaust to Japanese-American internment during World War II. Days of Future Past used the X-Men's fantastical setting to comment on very real human tendencies toward prejudice, fear, and oppression. The story also established Kate Pryde, the older version of Kitty, as a beloved character in her own right. The contrast between young, innocent Kitty and the hardened, desperate Kate showed what years of living in that dark future had done to her. It added depth to Kitty's character, showing readers what she could become, the strength she possessed beneath her teenage exterior. The Weapon X program, forging the perfect weapon. Among all the dark corners of X-Men lore, few are as infamous or as disturbing as the Weapon X program. This covert government initiative, responsible for transforming James Howlett into the man known as Wolverine, represents the darkest impulses of institutional power. The willingness to torture, brainwash, and dehumanize in pursuit of creating the perfect weapon. The Weapon X story, first told in detail by writer and artist Barry Windsor-Smith in Marvel Comics, presents issues 72 through 84 in 1991, revealed the horrific process that gave Wolverine his adamantium skeleton and stripped away much of his humanity. The man who would become Wolverine had a long history before Weapon X found him. Born in 19th century Canada as James Howlett to a wealthy family, he discovered his mutant powers, his bone claws and healing factor, during a traumatic childhood incident. Over the decades that followed, he lived many lives, as a wanderer, as a soldier in multiple wars, as a secret agent, and as a member of various covert operations teams. By the time the Weapon X program captured him in the late 1960s or early 70s, the exact timeline varies in different tellings. Logan had already lived more than a century and accumulated enough trauma to break most people. Weapon X itself was eventually revealed to be just one part of a larger initiative called Weapon Plus, a series of super soldier programs dating back to World War II. Weapon 1 had created Captain America through the super soldier serum. The projects that followed attempted to recreate or surpass that success, often with horrifying methods. Weapon X, the 10th in the series, focused on enhancing mutants, particularly those with healing factors that could survive the brutal augmentation process. The program was operated through Canada's Department K and overseen by a figure known simply as the Professor, along with scientists including Dr. Abraham Cornelius and Dr. Carol Hines. The Professor was a cold, calculating individual who saw test subjects not as people, but as raw materials to be shaped into living weapons. This dehumanization was central to Weapon X's methodology. They deliberately stripped away their subjects' identities, referring to Logan simply as specimen or by alphanumeric designations, never by name. Logan was captured or lured into the program through methods that varied in different retellings. Some versions suggested he volunteered for what he thought was a legitimate enhancement program. Others depicted him as forcibly abducted. Regardless of how he arrived, once in Weapon X's clutches, Logan became subject to one of the most horrific processes ever depicted in mainstream comics. Barry Windsor-Smith's artwork for the original Weapon X story arc portrayed the torture with unflinching honesty, showing a naked, vulnerable man being systematically destroyed and rebuilt. The central procedure involved bonding adamantium, a virtually indestructible metal, to Logan's entire skeleton. This wasn't a surgical process in any conventional sense. The adamantium was introduced into his body in molten form, coating every bone, including his claws, which were now covered in the super metal. The pain of this process was beyond imagination, even for someone with Logan's healing factor. The story showed Logan screaming in agony, his mind fragmenting under the assault on his body. The healing factor kept him alive throughout the procedure, but it also meant he experienced every excruciating moment without the mercy of unconsciousness or death. But the physical torture was only part of Weapon X's methodology. The program also employed sophisticated brainwashing and memory manipulation to create the perfect assassin. They wanted to strip away Logan's personality, his memories, his humanity, leaving only a killing machine that would follow orders without question. They subjected him to psychological conditioning, false memory implants, and mental programming designed to bring out his most violent instincts while suppressing any resistance or independent thought. The false memories were particularly insidious. Weapon X created entire lifetimes in Logan's mind, relationships and experiences that never happened, designed to keep him confused about his own identity and easier to control. These false memories would plague Logan for years afterward, making it nearly impossible for him to separate truth from fiction in his own past. This cognitive confusion was intentional, another layer of control over their weapon. The scientists running Weapon X kept Logan contained in a sensory deprivation tank for much of the process, suspended in fluid with wires and tubes penetrating his body. Smith's artwork showed this tank as a hellish womb, a place where a man was unmade and a weapon was forged. The imagery was nightmarish and deliberately disturbing, forcing readers to confront the inhumanity of what was being done. This wasn't heroic science or necessary defense. It was torture, pure and simple. What Weapon X hadn't accounted for was the strength of Logan's will. Despite their best efforts to break him, to reduce him to an unthinking weapon, something of the man remained buried beneath the programming. The moment came during a training exercise where Logan was being put through simulations designed to condition his killer instincts. In a moment of clarity or perhaps rage, Logan broke free of his restraints, unleashing the violence they'd been cultivating but directing it at his captors rather than their intended targets. The resulting rampage was spectacular and bloody. Logan tore through the Weapon X facility, killing guards and scientists, destroying equipment and fighting his way to freedom. His adamantium claws, now unbreakable weapons, cut through steel and flesh with equal ease. The healing factor repaired any damage he took. The berserker fury they'd been nurturing, intended to be deployed against enemies, was instead turned on them. Smith's artwork during these sequences was visceral and dynamic, showing Logan as a force of nature, unstoppable and savage. Logan escaped into the Canadian wilderness, the programming partially broken but the damage done. He was found months later by James and Heather Hudson, members of Department H, Canada's Superhuman Affairs Division. They helped him recover some measure of his humanity, giving him a home and eventually recruiting him for Canada's super team, Alpha Flight. But the scars of Weapon X, both physical and psychological, would never fully heal. The Weapon X story fundamentally changed how readers understood Wolverine. He wasn't just a tough guy with claws and a bad attitude. He was a victim of systematic torture, a man whose body and mind had been violated in pursuit of creating a weapon. His frequent berserker rages weren't just a personality quirk, but a response to deep trauma. His difficulty forming connections with others, his lone wolf tendencies, his cynicism about institutions and authority, all made sense in light of what had been done to him. The program itself became a recurring element in X-Men lore. It was revealed that many other individuals had been processed through various Weapon Plus initiatives, creating a whole population of enhanced beings with similar trauma. Sabretooth, Wolverine's archenemy, was revealed to be a fellow Weapon X subject. Deadpool, the wisecracking mercenary, received his healing factor through a later incarnation of the program. X-23, a female clone of Wolverine, was created by scientists who rebuilt the Weapon X project years later. Age of Apocalypse, reality reborn in darkness. In 1995, Marvel Comics launched one of the most ambitious and successful crossover events in X-Men history, Age of Apocalypse. This storyline didn't just occupy the X-Men titles. It completely replaced them for 4 months, canceling the entire line and replacing each book with new titles set in a dark alternate timeline. It was a bold gambit that could have backfired spectacularly, but instead, it became one of the most beloved storylines in X-Men history, introducing new characters, exploring dark what-if scenarios, and proving that the X-Men concept was flexible enough to be completely reinvented. The premise of Age of Apocalypse was rooted in time travel and tragedy. In the main Marvel timeline, Professor Xavier's son David Haller, also known as Legion, was a troubled young man whose mutant powers came with the curse of multiple personalities, each controlling a different ability. Legion loved his father and believed in Xavier's dream, but he was convinced that the dream could never be realized as long as Magneto lived. He believed that Magneto, as Xavier's greatest ideological opponent, was holding mutant kind back, preventing Xavier's vision from coming to fruition. In his disturbed state, Legion devised a plan to travel back in time and kill Magneto before Xavier and Eric's friendship fell apart, before the divide between them became permanent. He believed that without Magneto's opposition, Xavier could unite all mutants under his peaceful banner and guide mutant kind to acceptance. What Legion didn't understand, what his fractured mind couldn't grasp, was that his plan was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how heroism works. Xavier wasn't great because Magneto was evil. Their rivalry, their opposing philosophies, pushed both men to refine their arguments, to lead with conviction, to fight for what they believed in. Legion traveled back in time to a moment when Xavier and Magneto were still friends, still united in their hope for mutant kind's future. He attacked, using his vast mutant powers to strike at Magneto, but Xavier, seeing the assault, threw himself in front of his friend, taking the lethal blow meant for Magneto. Professor Charles Xavier died in the past, killed by his own son trying to secure his dream. The irony was devastating. In trying to help his father, Legion erased him from existence. Xavier's death in the past created a cascade of changes that rewrote reality. Without Xavier to found the X-Men, to advocate for peaceful coexistence, to serve as a moderating voice, the Marvel timeline split off in a dramatically different direction. Into the power vacuum stepped one of mutant kind's most ancient and powerful enemies, Saga, better known as Apocalypse. This being, who had lived for thousands of years, believed in survival of the fittest taken to its logical extreme. Only the strong deserve to exist, the weak should serve or perish. In the timeline Xavier would have created, Apocalypse was a recurring threat but one kept in check by heroes, including the X-Men. Without Xavier, without the X-Men, Apocalypse rose to power in the 1980s, decades before he would have in the main timeline. He gathered followers, powerful mutants who he dubbed his Horsemen, and launched a campaign of conquest. By the 1990s, Apocalypse ruled North America with an iron fist, having killed or enslaved billions. The world had become a nightmare of social Darwinism, where might made right and compassion was weakness. The Age of Apocalypse timeline showed familiar characters in unfamiliar roles, twisted by the different circumstances of this darker world. Magneto, filled with guilt over Xavier's death, had taken up his fallen friend's dream, leading a group of X-Men in Xavier's memory. But these weren't Xavier's peaceful, hopeful X-Men. Magneto's X-Men were hardened warriors, fighting a guerrilla war against an overwhelmingly powerful enemy, knowing that mercy could mean death not just for themselves, but for everyone they protected. The roster was a mix of familiar faces in new roles and entirely new characters created for this timeline. Rogue had absorbed the powers and psyche of Polaris permanently, giving her magnetic abilities to go with her absorption power. Blink, a teleporter who would later become a fan favorite, made her first appearance in this timeline. Sabretooth, traditionally a villain, was one of Magneto's most loyal X-Men, his savage nature channeled toward protecting the innocent. Wild Child, another typically villainous character, served on the team. And leading field operations was a character named Weapon X, this timeline's version of Wolverine, who had lost a hand to Cyclops, who in this reality served Apocalypse as one of his horsemen. The setup was brilliant because it allowed Marvel to explore what these characters might have become under different circumstances. Without Xavier's guidance and example, even heroes could become harder, more ruthless. Without Xavier's dream to rebel against, some villains might find their better natures. The Age of Apocalypse showed that heroism and villainy weren't inherent traits, but choices influenced by circumstance and opportunity. The storyline unfolded across multiple interconnected titles. X-Men became Astonishing X-Men, following Magneto's X-Men. Uncanny X-Men was replaced by Excalibur, featuring Nightcrawler's desperate mission to rescue the hidden mutant messiah. X-Factor became Factor X, showing Cyclops and Havoc as Apocalypse's elite agents. X-Force was replaced by Gambit and the Externals, following the Cajun Thief leading a team of young mutants. Generation X became Generation Next, featuring a team led by Colossus and Shadowcat trying to rescue mutant children. Cable's solo book became X-Man, introducing a character from this timeline who would eventually cross over into the main Marvel universe. Wolverine's solo title became Weapon X, following Logan's missions behind enemy lines. Each series contributed pieces to a larger narrative. The X-Men discovered the truth about their reality, that it shouldn't exist, that they were living in an aberrant timeline created by a time travel paradox. They learned about Bishop, a time traveler from another reality who retained memories of the true timeline. Bishop explained that Xavier had existed, that he'd founded the X-Men, that the world hadn't always been this nightmare ruled by apocalypse. The question became, could they fix it? Could they restore the proper timeline, even though doing so would erase everything and everyone in this reality from existence? This created a profound moral dilemma. Magneto's X-Men existed only because of the timeline change. Blink, Morph, and other characters were born only in this reality. To restore the correct timeline would be to commit cosmic genocide, erasing billions of lives, including their own. Yet if they didn't act, Apocalypse would continue his reign of terror, and humanity and mutant kind alike would suffer endless oppression. The heroes chose to sacrifice themselves, to restore a timeline they would never know, where they might not even exist, because it was the right thing to do. The plan required multiple teams executing coordinated missions simultaneously. Some X-Men would attack Apocalypse's citadel, drawing his forces' attention. Others would secure critical artifacts needed for the timeline repair. Another team would create the ritual that would send a signal back through time, warning Xavier's X-Men about Legion's plan. If they succeeded, the Age of Apocalypse timeline would cease to exist, reality rewriting itself back to the proper flow. The execution of this plan played out across all the Age of Apocalypse titles simultaneously, creating an epic, interconnected climax. The final battles were intense and costly. Characters died heroically, knowing their sacrifices would be erased when the timeline was fixed. Apocalypse himself was confronted, his tremendous power displayed in full. Magneto led the final charge, facing down the villain who had destroyed his world, fighting for a future he would never see. In the end, the heroes succeeded. The message was sent back through time. In the past, the X-Men intercepted Legion before he could kill Xavier. The Professor lived, the proper timeline continued, and the Age of Apocalypse ceased to exist, its heroes and horrors unmade. When readers returned to the regular X-Men titles after Age of Apocalypse, they found the familiar continuity restored. Xavier lived, the X-Men existed as they should, and the dark timeline was gone. But the storyline's impact lingered. Age of Apocalypse proved that X-Men stories could be radically reimagined and still work. The alternate versions of these characters were so compelling that some, like X-Men and Blink, crossed over into the main timeline and joined the regular Marvel universe. The meaning of mutation, social commentary and representation. From its inception, the X-Men franchise has been more than just another superhero team fighting colorful villains. At its core, the X-Men mythology has always been about prejudice, discrimination, and the struggle for acceptance in a society that fears difference. The mutant metaphor, intentionally or not, has spoken to generations of readers who have felt marginalized, othered, or oppressed because of who they are. Understanding this metaphorical dimension is essential to understanding why X-Men stories have endured and remained relevant across 6 decades. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby didn't necessarily set out to create a civil rights allegory when they launched X-Men in 1963, but the timing was significant. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum across America, with activists challenging segregation, discrimination, and systematic racism. The idea of a group born different, feared and hated by mainstream society, protecting a world that despised them, naturally resonated with the social upheaval of the era. By the late 70s, and especially through Chris Claremont's run, this metaphorical dimension became increasingly explicit and sophisticated. The comparison between Professor X and Martin Luther King Jr., between Magneto and Malcolm X became one of the most powerful aspects of X-Men mythology. Xavier's integrationist approach, his belief in peaceful coexistence achieved through demonstration of goodwill and patient advocacy, mirrored King's philosophy. Xavier taught his students to be heroes, to prove through their actions that mutants deserved respect and acceptance. He believed that if mutants showed humanity that they meant no harm, that they could contribute positively to society, hearts and minds would change. Magneto's more militant stance, his belief that mutants needed to claim power rather than ask for acceptance, his conviction that humans would never willingly grant mutants equality, echoed Malcolm X's more radical approach to civil rights. Magneto had witnessed the Holocaust, seen what humanity was capable of when prejudice was allowed to flourish unchecked. He refused to wait patiently for acceptance that might never come. His philosophy was one of self-determination and self-defense by any means necessary. The X-Men stories never definitively declared either man right or wrong, allowing readers to grapple with the complexity of both positions. The metaphor extended beyond just these two figureheads. The Sentinels, giant robots designed to hunt and capture mutants, represented systematic oppression given physical form. The idea that society would create weapons specifically to track, control, and eliminate a minority population echoed historical atrocities from slavery to genocide. The Mutant Registration Act, proposed multiple times in X-Men comics, required mutants to identify themselves to the government, be cataloged, and potentially monitored. This concept resonated with various real-world attempts to force marginalized groups to publicly identify themselves, from yellow stars in Nazi Germany to various registration systems affecting immigrants, communists, or other targeted populations. The X-Men's use of code names took on additional meaning in this context. When Scott Summers became Cyclops, when Jean Grey became Marvel Girl or Phoenix, they were choosing identities for themselves rather than accepting labels imposed by society. The X-Men's uniforms, particularly in later iterations when team members wore individualized costumes, became expressions of identity and self-determination. They weren't hiding who they were but presenting themselves on their own terms. As decades passed and society's understanding of marginalization evolved, the X-Men metaphor proved remarkably flexible. LGBTQ+ readers found powerful resonance in stories about mutants hiding their true nature from families who might reject them. The concept of coming out as a mutant, revealing one's identity to loved ones and facing potential rejection, directly paralleled the LGBTQ+ experience. The X-Men's found family dynamic, where mutants rejected by their biological families found acceptance and belonging with fellow X-Men, spoke to queer readers who had experienced similar journeys. One of the most powerful X-Men stories exploring this dimension came in the 1980s when Kitty Pryde, young and Jewish, faced anti-Semitism from a teammate and had to educate her fellow X-Men about prejudice and its many forms. This storyline explicitly connected the mutant metaphor to real-world discrimination, showing that the X-Men's fight wasn't just against supervillains, but against the everyday prejudices that exist in all societies. Later stories would explore other forms of discrimination, from xenophobia affecting immigrant mutants to ableism against physically disabled mutants. The concept of passing became significant in X-Men stories. Some mutants had visible mutations, like Nightcrawler's demonic appearance or Beast's blue fur, making it impossible for them to blend into human society. Others, like Jean Grey or Professor X, had powers that were invisible, allowing them to pass as human if they chose. This created hierarchies even within the mutant community, with visible mutants facing harsher discrimination than those who could hide their differences. The Morlocks, mutants whose appearances made them unable to pass as human, lived in sewers and tunnels beneath cities, rejected even by other mutants who looked down on them. The mutant metaphor also explored questions of nature versus nurture, of whether identity is chosen or innate. Mutants in the Marvel Universe are born with the X gene, but it typically doesn't manifest until puberty. This mirrors real experiences of discovering one's identity during adolescence, whether that's sexual orientation, gender identity, or other aspects of self. The confusion, fear, and sometimes joy that young mutants experience when their powers first manifested resonated with anyone who'd gone through the process of understanding who they truly were. Education played a crucial role in X-Men mythology, with Xavier's school serving as a sanctuary where young mutants could learn in safety. This reflected real-world debates about safe spaces, about the value of institutions specifically designed to serve marginalized communities. Some critics within the stories questioned whether segregating mutants in special schools was integration or just another form of separation, echoing real debates about historically black colleges, religious schools, or other specialized educational institutions. The franchise also explored the diversity within marginalized communities. Mutants weren't monolithic. They had different backgrounds, beliefs, and approaches to their situation. Some wanted integration like Xavier. Others wanted separatism like Magneto. Some, like the Morlocks, wanted simply to be left alone. Some mutants saw their powers as gifts. Others saw them as curses. This diversity of perspective reflected the reality that marginalized communities aren't unified voting blocks, but collections of individuals with varying views and experiences. The legacy and modern era, evolution of the X-Men. As we approach the present day, the X-Men franchise has evolved in ways that its creators could never have imagined in 1963. From a canceled comic kept alive only through reprints, the X-Men grew to become one of the most successful properties in all of entertainment, spawning multiple comic titles, animated series, blockbuster films, video games, and a cultural impact that extends far beyond the pages where they originated. Understanding this evolution reveals not just the history of a superhero team, but the changing landscape of comic books and popular culture itself. The 1980s and 90s represented the golden age of X-Men comics. Under Chris Claremont's guidance, the franchise expanded dramatically. Uncanny X-Men became Marvel's top-selling title, consistently outperforming even Spider-Man. The success led to spin-off series, New Mutants featuring younger students at Xavier's school, X-Factor starring the reunited original 5 X-Men, Excalibur following adventures of British-based mutants, and X-Force presenting a more militaristic approach to Xavier's dream. Each title had its own flavor while contributing to the larger X-Men mythology. The launch of a second main title, simply called X-Men, in 1991 became a watershed moment. The first issue, featuring artwork by superstar artist Jim Lee, sold over 8 million copies, making it the best-selling comic book of all time, a record that still stands. Lee's designs for the X-Men, particularly his iconic costume for Rogue and his angular, dynamic style, defined the look of the 90s X-Men for comics, animation, and merchandise. The animated X-Men series that debuted in 1992 on Fox Kids introduced an entire generation to the franchise, with its iconic theme song and faithful adaptations of classic stories making the X-Men household names. Major storylines from this era pushed the boundaries of what superhero comics could do. The Mutant Massacre in 1986 depicted the brutal slaughter of the Morlocks by the Marauders, a storyline so dark and violent that it shocked readers accustomed to more traditional superhero fare. Fall of the Mutants in 1988 killed off the entire X-Men team, only to resurrect them in Australia, setting up a year of stories where the team operated in secret. Inferno in 1989 brought demonic forces to New York City in a crossover that spanned the entire X-line. These weren't simple villain-of-the-month stories, but epic narratives with lasting consequences. The year 1995 brought Age of Apocalypse, discussed earlier, and also saw Claremont finally leave the franchise after 16 years. ending the longest continuous run by a single writer on a superhero team. His successors, including Scott Lobdell, Fabian Nicieza, and others, maintained the X-Men's popularity while introducing new characters who became instant fan favorites. Gambit, the Cajun thief with kinetic charging powers, became one of Marvel's most popular characters despite his morally ambiguous nature. Bishop, a time traveler from a dystopian future, brought new perspective to the team. Cable, the time-displaced son of Cyclops, added layers of temporal complexity to X-Men stories. The late 90s and early 2000s saw the X-Men franchise struggle somewhat. Editorial mandates, creative team changes, and increasingly convoluted storylines led to declining sales. The 1999 miniseries The 12 attempted to resolve dangling plot threads but left readers confused. The relationship between Cyclops and Jean Grey, one of the franchise's emotional anchors, became strained by infidelity subplots and resurrections that diminished the impact of character deaths. Then in the year 2000, Grant Morrison took over New X-Men, bringing a fresh, modern sensibility to the franchise. Morrison's running from 2000 to 2004, introduced new concepts that revitalized the property. The idea that mutation was fashionable, that some mutants were celebrities rather than feared outcasts, felt contemporary and realistic. The student body at Xavier's school expanded dramatically, with secondary characters getting development and spotlight. Morrison's stories dealt with genetic engineering, corporate manipulation of mutant genetics, and the idea that humanity might be naturally evolving toward mutanthood. The Weapon Plus program was expanded, revealing Captain America as Weapon 1 and showing that government experimentation on enhanced individuals had a 70-year history. Morrison also wrote one of the most controversial X-Men stories ever, revealing that Magneto had returned as the villain Zorn and destroyed much of Manhattan in a genocidal rage before being killed by Wolverine. This storyline divided fans, with some appreciating the return to Magneto as unambiguous villain and others feeling it betrayed decades of character development. It was later retconned that this wasn't actually Magneto, but an imposter, one of many continuity tangles that have plagued the franchise. Joss Whedon's run on Astonishing X-Men from 2004 to 2008 brought back a more classic feel while maintaining Morrison's contemporary edge. Whedon, fresh off his success with Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Firefly, understood ensemble storytelling and character dynamics. His run featured the return of Colossus, thought dead for years, and dealt with a cure for mutation, forcing characters to confront whether they'd choose to remain mutants if given the option. The storyline raised profound questions about identity and disability. If being a mutant could be cured, was it a disease, or was seeking a cure a form of genocide against an entire species? The House of M event in 2005 saw the Scarlet Witch, driven mad by grief and power, rewriting reality into a world where mutants were the dominant species and Magneto ruled. When reality was restored, she uttered 3 words that changed the X-Men forever: no more mutants. Suddenly, the mutant population dropped from millions to a few hundred. This decimation left the X-Men facing potential extinction, turning them from a thriving minority to an endangered species. The following years of X-Men comics dealt with this new status quo, with the remaining mutants gathering on the island of Utopia, off San Francisco's coast. In 2012, the Avengers vs. X-Men event pitted the two teams against each other over the return of the Phoenix Force. This led to Cyclops, longtime Boy Scout and leader of the X-Men, becoming increasingly militant and eventually killing Professor Xavier while possessed by a dark aspect of the Phoenix. This transformation of Cyclops into a revolutionary figure, leading a militant faction of X-Men, represented a major shift in the franchise's dynamics. The clean divide between Xavier's peaceful X-Men and Magneto's aggressive Brotherhood became muddier, with former heroes adopting more extreme methods. The most radical reinvention came in 2019 with the dawn of X Initiative, spearheaded by writer Jonathan Hickman. This storyline established Krakoa, the living island that had been the X-Men's enemy in giant-size X-Men #1, as a mutant nation. All mutants were invited to Krakoa, where they would live in safety and peace, their own sovereign nation recognized by human governments. Professor Xavier and Magneto, longtime rivals, led this new mutant nation together, their philosophies synthesized into a new approach. Most shockingly, Krakoa achieved something unprecedented: resurrection protocols that could bring dead mutants back to life, effectively granting them immortality. The Krakoan era transformed X-Men comics from stories about persecuted minorities seeking acceptance to stories about a thriving mutant civilization with its own culture, laws, and place on the world stage. Traditional villains like Apocalypse and Mr. Sinister became part of mutant kind's governing council. The X-Men weren't fighting for survival anymore. They were building a society. This represented the ultimate evolution of Xavier's dream, though achieved through methods he might not have approved of. Meanwhile, the X-Men films that began in the year 2000 introduced the franchise to mainstream audiences in a new medium. Hugh Jackman's portrayal of Wolverine became iconic, making the character a household name beyond comic fandom. Patrick Stewart's Professor Xavier and Ian McKellen's Magneto brought gravitas to their roles. The films took liberties with the comic stories, but maintained the core themes about prejudice and acceptance. Later films like First Class, Days of Future Past, and Logan explored different eras and tones, with Logan in particular delivering a powerful meditation on aging, legacy, and redemption. The X-Men have also been featured in video games, from arcade brawlers to complex RPGs. The animated series have continued beyond the iconic 90s show, with X-Men Evolution and Wolverine, and the X-Men exploring new takes on the characters. Most recently, the Disney Plus series X-Men '97 continues the story of the classic animated series, introducing those beloved versions of the characters to new generations, while giving longtime fans closure on storylines left unresolved. As we look at the X-Men today, we see a franchise that has continuously reinvented itself while maintaining its core identity. The specific manifestation of the team may change, the social issues they metaphorically represent may evolve, the roster may expand or contract, but the fundamental truth remains. The X-Men are heroes who protect a world that fears them, fighting for a dream that maybe one day humans and mutants will see each other as equals. That dream, first articulated in September of 1963, remains as compelling today as it was over 60 years ago. Conclusion: the story of the X-Men is ultimately a story about hope in the face of prejudice, about finding family when the world rejects you, about fighting for what's right even when the odds seem insurmountable. From their creation in 1963 through cancellation and rebirth, through Dark Phoenix and Days of Future Past, through extinction and evolution, the X-Men have endured as one of fiction's most compelling superhero teams precisely because they represent something more than superpowers and costumed adventures. They represent everyone who has ever felt like an outsider, everyone who has been judged for something they couldn't control, everyone who has struggled to find their place in a world that seems determined to reject them. Whether you're a person of color facing racism, an LGBTQ+ individual struggling with acceptance, an immigrant searching for belonging, or simply someone who feels different, the X-Men offer a fantasy of finding others like you, of discovering that being different isn't something to be hidden but something to be celebrated. Professor Xavier's dream, that dream of peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, between the majority and the minority, between the powerful and the vulnerable, remains unfulfilled in the pages of X-Men comics. And perhaps that's appropriate. The dream isn't meant to be achieved in a single story or a single issue. It's an ongoing struggle, a constant effort, a goal worth fighting for even when it seems impossible. As long as prejudice exists in the real world, as long as people are marginalized for who they are, the X-Men will remain relevant, their stories a mirror reflecting our own society's struggles with difference and acceptance. So here's to the X-Men, to the original five who started it all, to the international team that saved the franchise, to all the characters who have worn the X over the decades. Here's to their victories and their defeats, their triumphs and their tragedies. Here's to Professor Xavier's impossible dream and Magneto's necessary resistance. Here's to the writers and artists who have told their stories, to the fans who have kept them alive across 6 decades, and to the next generation who will discover these heroes and find in them the same hope, the same inspiration, the same promise that being different doesn't mean being alone. If you enjoyed this deep dive into X-Men lore, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Sleepy Comics for more explorations of comic book history and mythology. What's your favorite X-Men story? Which character resonates most with you? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, remember, we are all mutants in our own way, all different, all special, all worthy of acceptance and love. Stay sleepy, comic fans.